The little-known Latin expression non gratum anus rodentum translates as not worth a rat's ass. It was this ironic phrase that became the motto of the tunnel rats. This was the informal name given to American, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers who during the Vietnam War performed the most dangerous task, descending into the notorious Vietcong underground tunnels. Underground, the soldiers had some nasty surprises, and not always they came back alive and healthy. A fascinating video awaits you. If this video gets 100 likes, I will shoot a sequel. So, let's get started. Clay cities, tunnels in Vietnam. The Vietnamese began to dig the first underground tunnels back in the mid-1940s during the First Indochinese War of Independence against the French colonists. At that time there were still not many of them, which did not prevent Vietnam from winning. But with the arrival of the US Army in Vietnam in the 1960s, the tunnel underground network quickly grew to hundreds of miles. Digging them became a major occupation for thousands of selfless Vietnamese volunteers, wielding hoes and baskets. These paths had to be dug in laterite clay. In dry weather it was impossible to work with it. It dries and hardens like a stone, but when the rainy season begins, it softens, and digging it becomes easy. When the rainfall ends and the clay dries out again, the tunnel walls become as strong as concrete. The Vietnamese tried never to dig tunnels strictly in straight lines. Underground paths were usually dug at an angle of 60 to 120 degrees. This made the tunnels very difficult and inconvenient for small arms fire, and the loud sounds of gunfire in the narrow passages hurt the eardrums. Moreover, the clay walls reflected the blast of exploding grenades. Each tunnel had several drainage wells that were 30 meters deep, thanks to which the tunnels did not flood during the rainy seasons. The entrance to such a subway tunnel was narrow, about 60 by 90 centimeters. All underground tunnels of the Vietnamese were divided into simple and complex. The small burrows, dug in the ground and from 5 to 100 meters long, belonged to the simple ones. There was nothing extra in such tunnels, just an ambush place, a place of concealment and a secret passage for urgent evacuation. The entrances and exits of such tunnels, so-called spider holes, were carefully camouflaged. The complex tunnels are another matter. The Vietcong dug them in several levels, placing them on top of each other and connecting them with each other by narrow manholes. The tunnels went 20 to 25 meters deep, turning them into underground cities. On different floors there were hospitals, training camps, warehouses, barracks, kitchens, and printing houses. The guerrillas kept many trophy weapons in their armory. Legend has it that they once managed to hide an American battle tank in their dungeon. Homemade anti-personnel mines were made in primitive blacksmith shops. The guerrillas had enough drinking water and food to maintain a relatively safe existence for months. Underground there were also ventilation shafts which gave the communists fresh air, but it was still very stuffy in there. Underground doctors operated on wounded fighters with primitive surgical instruments, almost always without anesthesia. Drills were used to operate on the brain, amputations were done with hacksaws, and the instruments were sterilized in frying pans. Dim lighting in the wards was provided by handheld generators. Some tunnels even had amateur theaters where political plays were staged. The Vietnamese were helped to fight by their children, and a kind of school class was organized for them. The Vietcong buried their fallen comrades in arms in the underground, so the American army had no exact information about the losses of the enemy. They made holes in the walls for the dead, laid them there in the fetal position and covered them with a thin layer of clay. The tunnels were arranged so that if the Americans attacked, they could take cover quickly and still be able to attack from there. Sometimes it happened that the Vietnamese could no longer stay in the tunnels. In such cases, they would leave them through hidden exits, leaving ammunition and provisions there. When the Americans left the area and it became safe, the Vietcong would return to their tunnels. A classic example of a complex tunnel is in the Siu Chi area, 20 miles north of Saigon. During the war, the area was heavily bombed, and at times no stone was left on the surface of the ground. But beneath the surface, the underground tunnel that housed thousands of Viet Cong fighters continued to live on. Some tunnels in Qui Chu and other parts of Vietnam stretched for hundreds of miles, as far as the Cambodian border. Underground fighters. The Americans, along with their Australian and New Zealand allies, faced tunnel attacks in the earliest days of the Vietnam War. They realized, without a solution to this problem, they could not win. At first they tried to destroy the underground cities by bombing them from the outside, but because of their complex and intricate system and dense clay it was not successful. The maximum they could manage was to destroy only some part of the tunnel, but the Vietnamese quickly built a detour. After that, the Americans tried to throw grenades and gas canisters inside the tunnels, but even that did not do the Vietnamese any serious damage. The Americans began to send dogs into the underground caves, but the dogs were blown up by landmines and died. The dog handlers refused to send their wards to their certain death. It became clear we had to use humans. So a new unit nicknamed Tunnel Rats appeared in the US Army. The first such unit was formed on the basis of the 25th Infantry Division, and later such units appeared in all American divisions. Only volunteers were recruited there. Athletic, but lean fighters with height no higher than 165 centimeters, who did not suffer from claustrophobia were needed. They were almost always soldiers of European, Puerto Rican or Mexican descent, the best able to meet the requirements. Before going underground for the first time, the Tunnel Rats spent 3 months learning how to look for mines, avoid traps, and plant explosives. Usually they worked in pairs. One went underground and radioed information about the tunnel to his partner outside, who drew a rough map of the underground city. Sometimes the Tunnel Rats would enter the underground as a group. They walked a few meters apart so they wouldn't be killed by a booby trap. The Tunnel Rats chose suitable places and laid mines to destroy the underground passage if the task required it. Sometimes the fighters would not destroy a dungeon by necessity, but rather capture one of its inhabitants or take important documents. It was one of the most difficult tasks, given that the soldiers were confronted by hundreds of guerrillas, for whom all these labyrinths had already become, in effect, a second home. In addition to general physical training, the Tunnel Rats had many other requirements. They had to make every move and every step with the utmost care. They were required to hide in the dark so that the Vietnamese would not suspect that uninvited guests had entered the dungeon. But the most important thing required of them was sound psychological training. Many of those who wanted to become Tunnel Rats could never bring themselves to descend into a frightening dungeon where anything could await them. Experienced Tunnel Rats, on the other hand, lost their emotional sensitivity so much over time that they were no longer afraid to enter the tunnel at all. For them it became a regular routine activity. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Give it a thumbs up. Tell us interesting facts you know about the topic of this video. See you in new videos.